Sometimes I just wish Paul would get to the point. What was that all about? It just seemed like a lot, especially after we had to sit through that really long-winded two-story thing. There's a really important theological way of describing that story in Mark. It's called a twofer, because it's two stories in one. Yeah. But Paul just like yammers on and finally gets to the point. And let's be fair, we're reading correspondence, right? We're reading a letter he wrote to somebody else. And we don't know why he wrote the letter because we don't know what was communicated to him. We can guess. And actually with the Corinthians, it's really easy to guess. It's pretty clear they weren't getting along. It's pretty clear why they weren't getting along as well. And so he has lots of really interesting advice about that. And if you read both letters to the Corinthians, that we call letters to the Corinthians, and in fact are probably several letters that were sort of put together by somebody so that we could put them into this format. But it's pretty clear that they were struggling as a community. And so Paul gives them some really important advice and lets them know some really important things. And one of those things is they weren't getting along because, and you'll find this really interesting, they were a really diverse community. Not just in the way that we tend to talk about diversity these days, but in every way, they were a very diverse community. There were men and women, there were children, there were people of all ages, there were people of different social stratus, right? Because structure in those days was always really important. There were people who had money and people who didn't. There were people who were employed and people who weren't. There were people who were just really different, trying to come together with Jesus. And Paul's best advice is, Paul's best advice is equality. I think he means equity. Because Paul would have thought everyone needs to have what they need, just as Jesus did. And that's not necessarily how we understand equality these days. Equality is you all get the same. But if your needs are different, how is that fair? It's only fair from my perspective because I'm the person who's distributing whatever it is that I'm distributing. You all get the same. But if your needs are different, that is not necessarily helpful. Particularly if your needs are different because you come to where you are from a very different journey than others. Perhaps your journey has involved things like prejudice and oppression. Perhaps your journey has involved stories and life where you just didn't have what everyone else had. Not just financially, but maybe in terms of opportunity too. So giving everybody the same thing wouldn't be particularly helpful to some. Might be helpful to a few. But we only have limited resources, so we have to share it equally amongst everyone. And Paul, I think, is trying to say, no, that's not how it works. That's not how it works. How it works is those who need should have what they need. And those who have it to offer should offer it. Sometimes it's less a question of how much have I got and more a question of realizing it, realizing how much you have and what you can give. And so Paul's advice to the community is stop worrying, and honestly read all of 1 and 2 Corinthians. Stop worrying about all of this stuff about like your place in society or how much money you have or whether you were a slave or whether you were, whatever you were, whoever you are. Equity is about sharing what we need. Don't you think that's a key part of that story from Mark? It might seem at first like there's absolutely nothing in common between the two main characters in the story, other than Jesus, of course, and the crowd. I'll come back to that in a second. But don't you, it seems like there's nothing in common, right? Jairus is a leader in the community. He's from the synagogue. He clearly has money because he has a place. He has status. And he has a name even, which is unusual in these stories. So he must be important. He has a name. The woman who has no name comes from a very different circumstance. Now, it might be that she did have money. She must have if she spent money on doctors. But now she's reached a point where she has nothing. In fact, what the heck was she doing in the crowd? Because that's the kind of the condition that she has is the kind of thing that would be considered ritually unclean. She shouldn't be around anybody. She shouldn't even be around her family. She's an outcast. She shouldn't have been there. And Jesus' appropriate response to her should have been, "Get away from me. How dare you touch me?" Because her touching him makes him ritually unclean. By the way, touching the dead also makes you ritually unclean. So the one thing that really ties these two stories together, more than anything else, isn't just the healing, it's a possibility that Jesus would be made ritually unclean, which would make Jesus an outcast. How much do you think Jesus cares about that? Not at all. How much do you think Jesus cares about the fact that Jairus is a leader in the synagogue and this lady is no one? Not at all. In fact, it's not just a question of offering what is needed, it's a question of offering when it's needed. That's the cool thing about how this one story interrupts the other. It's not a delaying tactic so that when Jesus gets there, the young girl will have died and he can raise her from the dead, because it's not like it's the only time he does that. It's that he attends to people when they need attending to. He stops for the woman in the crowd because the woman reaches out to him. He stops for Jairus because Jairus reaches out to him. And he responds to them in their need. Doesn't matter who they are, doesn't matter how they came to him. He responds to them in their need. It doesn't matter that he's risking being made ritually unclean, which would make him an outcast. Although, you'd have a tricky time proving that, wouldn't you? Because if the woman has been healed, she's no longer ritually unclean, and if the child is alive, they are no longer ritually unclean. So, prove it. The point is, if you think that the story is just about Jesus heals, awesome, good for you, miracle story. But there's another miracle in the story, and that's the miracle for the crowd that learns that day that Jesus responds to people in need when they are in need. And it doesn't matter who they are. They get his attention equitably. They get what Jesus is able to offer equitably. That's the point of the story, I think. And it's such a great story for Bible studying because there are all sorts of little bits and pieces and things that are really interesting historical pieces from the first century and about traditions and about rituals and things. But ultimately, none of that matters to Jesus. None of it. What matters to Jesus is responding to people when they are in need. And it would truly be a miracle if we learned that from the story. That need has nothing to do with your place in society. It has nothing to do with what you have or don't have. It doesn't have anything to do with who you are, how you are, what culture you are, tradition, gender, anything else. What it has to do with is that we are all children of God, and Jesus responds to us in our need. That's our learning. I hope, it's something that crowd learned that day. Not just that, oh my goodness, how powerful is Jesus, but that he sets an example of care and love for others. A generosity of love that cares for others.